For 5 long years he endured the rain, the cold, and the contempt of those who deemed him weak. But on the day he returned, with a resolute gaze and an unexpected gesture, everyone who had humiliated him felt their blood run cold. As silence took over, no one could believe what was about to happen. Rain hammered the tin roof so furiously it seemed ready to split the metal wide open. For 5 long years, this same downpour had visited almost every evening, sometimes gentle as a lullaby, other times violent as a warning. In an isolated corner of the northern countryside, all that existed were jagged cliffs, dense conifer forests, and a solitary cabin perched at the edge of an abandoned logging road. The wind howled around that cabin like a wolf circling its prey, but he never complained. He had become used to hardship, to the quiet scraping of hunger, and to the cold ache in his bones whenever winter decided to settle for weeks at a time. His name was Elias Morgan, a man whose silence had become his armor against the relentless trials of nature and life itself. Elias first arrived in this remote wilderness with a single duffel bag and a broken spirit. That was 5 winters ago. He had lived in the city once, a place of steel bridges and gray pavements, where people scurried like insects, rarely pausing to acknowledge a stranger's pain. In those days, he had had a small apartment, a job that paid enough for rent and groceries, and a fiancée who believed that love could conquer any obstacle. But when the factory where Elias worked shut down abruptly, it unleashed a sequence of losses: his job, his savings, and finally the one person who had promised to stand by him. A swirl of debts consumed his life. The city's neon signs, once full of promise, turned merciless and mocking. So he fled to the only place left to go, a derelict property that had once belonged to his grandfather, hidden away in a wilderness few dared to visit. At first he believed he could fix the old cabin, maybe even chop wood to sell in the nearest town. He told himself a fresh start in a rugged environment would heal the shame that clung to him. But healing never came easily. The roads leading to that lonely domain were so battered by storms and rock slides that vehicles seldom passed. The nearest settlement lay nearly 20 miles south, separated by steep slopes and unpredictable weather. Elias discovered in his first long winter that supplies might not always arrive on time. Snow could trap him for weeks, with only the howling wind for company. Neighbors existed somewhere beyond the hills, but they might as well have inhabited a different planet. The rainfall was incessant, the nights seemingly eternal, and through it all he remained silent, punishing himself, perhaps, for failing to keep the life he once thought secure. Over the years he became almost as much a part of the forest as the ancient pines. He learned which mushrooms were safe to eat, which roots could be turned into broth. He discovered how to catch fish in the raging currents of the streams that rushed down the mountainsides, yet each day felt more isolated than the last. Even when the sun managed to pierce the clouds, Elias felt no warmth inside his heart. He forbade himself from looking at old photographs, from recalling the city, from remembering the people who once loved him. That was the only way to survive, building a wall inside his mind. If loneliness ached in his chest, he fought it by working until his muscles screamed for rest. Then came the storm that changed everything. It was early autumn, but the sky was ink black like the dead of winter, and the wind battered the forest so hard that trees bent at unnatural angles. Rain fell in sheets, soaking every inch of soil. Elias braced himself in the cabin, checking that the shutters were secure, the roof was sealed, and his meager store of dried goods was safe from leaks. Thunder reverberated through the valley, echoing off the cliffs. He'd heard storms like this before, but something about that night felt different. The pressure in the air made him uneasy. Lightning flashed in rapid, blinding bursts. Amid that chaos, he heard a sound so faint that at first he dismissed it as his imagination. Another gust of wind rattled the windows, and again it came. A distant cry, maybe human, maybe an animal. Elias froze, heart pounding. He tried telling himself it was just the gale howling through the pines, yet, between claps of thunder, it surfaced once more. Sharper this time, like someone or something in distress. His breath caught. In 5 years, nobody had ever ventured this far without warning, especially not on a night like this. Could it be a wounded deer? A lost hiker? Instinct warred with caution. He glanced at the battered flashlight hanging on the wall. The next moment, he was shrugging into his threadbare raincoat. He snatched up the flashlight, tested its sputtering beam, and trudged out into the tempest. Each step sank into mud. The fierce wind threatened to knock him off balance. Branches littered the ground, shattered by the raging storm. The cry came again. Elias angled his flashlight in that direction, discovering the source near a hollow beneath an uprooted tree. At first he thought it was a large dog or perhaps a small deer. Then the flashlight revealed a person, a child, drenched and shivering, wedged into the narrow space under that exposed root system. Shock coursed through Elias. No child could possibly survive out here alone, especially in these conditions. Without hesitation, he waded closer, nearly tripping on twisted roots. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice cracking after years of near silence. The child, a boy no older than 10, looked up, eyes wide with fear. His clothes were torn, and an ugly gash ran along his right forearm. He hugged himself, trembling violently. The sense of desperation in his gaze shook Elias to his core. That unguarded vulnerability shattered the wall he had built inside himself. "We need to get you out of here," Elias said, forcing calm into his voice. The boy tried to speak, but his words were lost in the roar of thunder. Without another word, Elias scooped him up in his arms. The child was cold as ice. Even his breath seemed faint. Elias shielded him from the worst of the downpour, pressing forward against the tearing wind. Rain lashed his face, stinging his eyes. Several times he slipped, nearly falling on the slick ground, but he refused to let go of the boy. Each step hammered home the truth. For the first time in half a decade, he was responsible for another human being. By the time they reached the cabin, Elias was shaking with exhaustion, but the child's condition terrified him more. He kicked the door shut behind them and quickly wrapped the boy in the thickest blanket he could find. The child's teeth chattered so hard it sounded like a rattle. Elias grabbed a towel, gently drying his face and arms. He rummaged through cupboards for medical supplies. A meager first aid kit was all he had. The cut needed cleaning before infection set in. He didn't know the boy's name or where he'd come from, but none of that mattered now. Survival was all that counted. Elias cleaned the wound carefully, biting his lip at the boy's silent wince. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "but we have to do this." Outside, the wind howled, branches scraping the cabin walls, a reminder that no help would come from beyond those battered hills. The world had shrunk to just the two of them, cast adrift in a sea of darkness. When the wound was finally bandaged, Elias carried the boy to the old bed in the corner, bundling him under layers of blankets. The child's eyes fluttered open for a moment. Elias expected fear, confusion, or a flurry of questions. Instead, he saw a fragile trust, a willingness to accept protection without the usual suspicion. Elias lowered himself to a stool by the bed, uncertain what else to say or do. Hours passed in tense stillness. He checked the boy's temperature by pressing a hand to his forehead. His skin was cool, but the convulsive shivers had eased. The child slipped into a restless sleep, faint whimpers escaping now and then, but at least he seemed stable. Elias found himself wondering, where had the boy come from? How did he get lost in these woods? Had someone abandoned him? Or was there a search party out there, scouring the forest for him at this very moment? He shook his head, scanning the cabin. Though simple, it was functional, with a small stove, a table, and a single shelf of supplies. He stoked the fire in the iron fireplace until the flames rose higher, bringing warmth to fight off the chill. Despite exhaustion tugging at him, Elias remained awake, determined not to leave the boy's side. Sometime after midnight, the storm's fury began to subside, the thunder receding into a distant murmur. Only the rain continued, a steady hiss against the roof. Long after the final echo of thunder, Elias stared at the sleeping child's face, lit by the flicker of embers. A quiet dread gnawed at him. He had learned how to endure solitude, to face every morning's gloom with stoicism, but he had no idea how to care for a wounded child, physically or emotionally. Memories of the city threatened to resurface, pulling him back to the regrets he'd tried so hard to bury. For years he had spoken little, trusting even less. Now that self-imposed silence felt like a heavy chain he wasn't sure how to break. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe, just maybe, this boy's appearance was a lifeline, a chance to reconnect with a world he had shunned. Or maybe it was fate's cruel trick forcing him to relive heartbreak if something happened to the child. His thoughts spiraled in the dancing shadows. There was no turning back. At the first hint of dawn, if the boy was strong enough, Elias would decide what to do. For now, he would watch over him, counting heartbeats and listening to the soft hush of the rain. Sometime near sunrise, the child stirred, letting out a faint cry. Elias leaned forward. "It's all right," he whispered, voice cracking. "You're safe here." The boy opened his eyes, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. His mouth formed a silent question, but Elias wasn't sure he could answer. The only certainty was that they were stuck with each other. Two souls adrift in a wilderness, neither fully understood. He survived 5 harsh years of rain, cold, and silence. Had it all been leading to this moment? That question burned in Elias's mind. As the boy blinked under the gray light creeping through the shutters, Elias felt the first spark of something he hadn't allowed himself in a very long time: hope. Out there, the forest continued to drip with leftover rain, and the wind still prowled. But inside these rough-hewn walls, something incredible had begun. A child's life was now interwoven with his own, forging a connection that might save them both. Elias leaned back, exhaustion claiming him at last, while the child's eyes flickered with the faint promise of trust. At dawn, Elias woke to the faint glow that filtered through the warped wooden shutters. His body ached from spending the night half dozing on a stool, but the memory of the child's ragged breathing jolted him fully awake. The boy lay still under a heap of blankets, chest rising and falling in a slow but steady rhythm. Elias exhaled with relief, half expecting to find the bed empty, as if the events of the previous night had been a figment of the storm. But there he was, a real child, bruised and cold, yet alive. Elias quietly approached, unsure how to begin. Carefully, Elias touched the boy's forehead. It was cooler than before, but not worryingly so. Outside, a gentle rain continued, pattering on the soil with the last remnants of the storm. He wondered whether the sun might appear fully today. In his 5 years out here, such appearances were rare, especially in autumn. He poured water from his metal pitcher into a pot and placed it atop the wood-burning stove. Warm tea might help if the boy woke up soon. Then he surveyed the meager contents of his pantry: a few strips of salted fish, some dried berries, a dwindling supply of flour. Suddenly, a soft moan made him spin around. The boy was stirring, blinking at the cabin with eyes wide in confusion. Elias took a hesitant step forward, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe," he murmured, aware that his own voice sounded foreign after so many years of near silence. The boy tried to speak, but ended up just parting his lips without sound. He looked down at the bandage on his arm, then back at Elias, as though trying to piece together the puzzle of how he'd arrived here. Elias placed a gentle hand on the blanket. "What's your name?" he asked, The child flinched slightly, then swallowed. "Nico," he whispered, voice scratchy from cold and thirst. Elias repeated the name quietly, as if to seal it in his memory. "All right, Nico," he said, feeling awkward, yet determined. "Let me get you some warm water. The storm last night. I found you outside." Nico nodded, eyes still darting around the unfamiliar space. For a moment, Elias feared the boy might panic and try to run. But Nico just drew the blanket tighter around himself, realizing how cold it still was inside the cabin. Outside, the sky remained leaden with heavy clouds. Elias realized that he needed to keep Nico conscious and calm. "Are you alone?" he asked gently. Nico's gaze dropped. At first, Elias worried the question had triggered some painful memory, but then the boy shook his head. "There was a car," he managed. "It slid off the road. My father, we got separated." The words jolted Elias like an electric shock. He pictured a twisted vehicle somewhere in the forest, or possibly an injured man fighting to survive in the unforgiving elements. "Where?" he pressed, though his tone remained soft. "We have to find him." In a halting voice, Nico explained that they'd been traveling north on a narrow logging road when the storm intensified. The car skidded, crashed through underbrush, and lurched to a stop near a small ravine. Nico managed to crawl out but became disoriented in the swirling rain. He remembered his father yelling something about trying to find help, and then everything blurred. "I couldn't see him anymore," the boy whispered, voice trembling. The ache of guilt in his words was unmistakable. Elias placed a hand on Nico's shoulder. "We'll look, but first you need some strength." The tea had warmed enough, so Elias poured a cup, letting the boy sip it slowly. With every swallow, color returned to Nico's cheeks. Elias set a small plate of dried berries and fish on the bed, hoping the boy would try to eat. While Nico nibbled uncertainly, Elias stared at the battered map tacked to one wall of the cabin. After 5 years, he knew these hills intimately, but even he felt uneasy, venturing far after such a violent storm. The soil would be treacherous, and streams prone to flash floods. Still, leaving a wounded man out there wasn't an option. "Stay here and rest," Elias told Nico. "I'll search for your father, but I need you to promise you won't wander off. This place can be dangerous if you don't know it well." Nico swallowed hard, glanced at the battered door, and nodded. "I won't go anywhere," he said, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Elias gathered what little gear he had, his flashlight, some rope, and a makeshift first aid kit. Before leaving, he piled more wood into the stove, ensuring there'd be warmth. Then he hesitated, uncertain if he should truly leave a frightened boy alone. "Listen," Elias said, crouching beside the bed so their eyes were level. "I'll be back as soon as I can. If the fire goes low, feed it with the smaller logs by the door. If you feel too cold, wrap up with extra blankets." Nico nodded again, though his eyes shone with a mix of dread and hope. Elias forced a reassuring smile, though he felt far from sure himself. Then he slipped out, bracing against the damp chill that still clung to the forest. Clouds threatened more rain, and the wind hissed through the pines like distant whispers of caution. His boots sank into the mud with each step along the overgrown trail. Fallen branches blocked the path in several places, forcing him to detour. A swirling mist rose from pockets of water, creating ghostly figures between the trees. Elias tried to recall the last time he had ventured so far from the cabin. Weeks, perhaps months. He had no reason to roam beyond what was necessary for hunting or gathering. Now, necessity drove him deeper. The battered map in his mind suggested that if Nico's father had been driving north, the old logging road would cut sharply near a rocky slope. That was the likeliest place to slide off in a storm. He found the tracks half an hour later. Deep ruts in the soft earth, leading off the road. 10 yards away, the battered remains of a sedan lay crumpled against a pine. The windshield was a web of shattered glass, the driver's door bent open. Elias's heart pounded. He circled the wreck cautiously. "Hello?" he called, scanning the shadows. No answer. He peered inside. The seats were soaked, pieces of the dashboard strewn about. Blood dotted the steering wheel, but there was no sign of the driver. A set of footprints led away from the crash, disappearing into the undergrowth. Elias followed the footprints with mounting concern. They were uneven, as though the man had been limping or stumbling. A few hundred feet in, he discovered fresh scraps of cloth snagged on a branch. The forest was eerily silent, save for the gentle drip of water from the treetops. Occasionally, a distant crow cawed, but no human voice returned Elias's calls. He pressed on, mind racing. If Nico's father was grievously injured, time was short. The terrain grew steeper, and he had to steady himself against tree trunks. Twice he nearly lost his footing on slick moss. Each second felt like a countdown he couldn't stop. Finally, in a dense thicket, Elias glimpsed a figure sprawled beneath a tangle of fallen branches. His pulse hammered. He hurried forward, pushing aside limbs to reveal a man in a torn jacket, hair matted with mud and blood. The man's breathing was shallow and his face pale as ash. Elias knelt, checking for a pulse. It was there, faint but present. "Hang on," he muttered, voice unsteady. He cleared branches carefully, noticing the man's leg was twisted at a sickening angle. "Your son is safe. We'll get you help." The man's eyelids flickered, perhaps a sign he heard those words. Summoning strength from a place he thought long dead, Elias braced himself to lift the unconscious figure. The forest around them seemed to pause, as if holding its breath for a long-forgotten moment of humanity. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias felt the faintest stirrings of purpose, something beyond mere survival, an echo of what it once meant to care for another person. As he began the arduous trek back to the cabin, rain started falling again, but he neither cursed nor flinched. Let it fall, he thought, refusing to yield. Rain, cold, silence. He had endured them all. Now something incredible was pushing him onward, and no storm would stand in his way. Carrying Nico's father was a grueling ordeal that tested every ounce of energy Elias had. The man's weight sagged heavily in his arms, and the muddy terrain felt more treacherous with each step. Rain mists swirled, obscuring tree roots and fallen branches, so Elias was forced to watch every footfall, mindful not to slip and risk further injury to the unconscious stranger. He paused whenever his arms began to tremble, using precious seconds to catch his breath. In those moments, his gaze drifted to the man's ashen face, half hidden by dark hair matted with dirt. Elias knew that time was critical. Each delay could mean the difference between life and death. Guilt flickered through him, as if all his years of self-imposed solitude had somehow cost him the instincts to help another, but he pushed that thought aside and forced his legs onward. At last, the cabin's outline emerged between trees stripped bare by storms. Elias summoned a final burst of strength, nearly stumbling up the rickety steps. With a pained grunt, he shouldered the door open and hauled the man inside, where Nico stood waiting, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. Elias gently laid the father on the cabin's only small table, sweeping aside an old lantern and some tools to make room. Nico hovered at the edge, trembling in the drafty air. The boy's clothes were still damp from the previous night, but he seemed too worried about his father to notice his own discomfort. "He's hurt bad," the boy whispered, voice catching. Elias pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck and felt a faint pulse, irregular but present. A wave of relief washed over him. He carefully peeled back the torn jacket sleeve, revealing an ugly bruise that spread across the father's upper arm, while the twisted angle of his leg suggested a possible break. Nico's eyes brimmed with tears, but he blinked them back, refusing to cry in front of this near stranger. Elias glanced around, muttering under his breath. He had only basic medical supplies, a roll of bandages, a small bottle of antiseptic, and scraps of cloth. It would have to suffice. Hang in there, Elias murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the father or himself. He stoked the fireplace until flames danced higher, fighting off the chill that seeped through the walls. Then he addressed Nico in the gentlest tone he could manage. "I need hot water. Remember how I showed you the stove? Fill the pot halfway and place it on the heat." Nico nodded and hurried over. Elias used the pause to check for other injuries. A shallow cut ran along the man's hairline, caked with dried blood. His breathing caught sometimes, as though each breath demanded more strength than he possessed. Elias had seen animals in critical shape before, but never a person. Still, he forced himself to remain calm. Overwhelmed or not, he had accepted this responsibility the moment he carried the man from the forest. Nico returned with the steaming pot and set it carefully on the table. Together, they cleaned the father's wounds, Elias using the antiseptic, Nico dabbing away blood with a cloth. Neither spoke much, but the urgency drew them into a quiet partnership. Whenever the father stirred and groaned, Nico whispered words of reassurance. Elias tested the range of movement in the injured leg and felt bones shift beneath his hand. He grimaced. A break, perhaps even more complicated than a clean fracture. Setting it without proper equipment was risky, but the nearest doctor was likely days away and the logging roads had to be all but impassable after the storm. "Do you know your father's name?" Elias asked. The boy blinked, as though surprised by the question. "It's Jonas," he said softly. Elias repeated the name in his mind, thinking it might help him stay grounded. Jonas, father of Nico, a man who needed help that Elias was only barely equipped to give. When the makeshift splint was done, Elias bound it as best he could with strips of cloth. Jonas moaned, eyes fluttering open for half a second before sinking back into unconsciousness. Nico clutched Elias's arm. "He opened his eyes," the boy whispered, hope mingling with terror. Elias gave a small nod. "It's a good sign," he said, though his own heart pounded. The cabin's sparse light made everything look harsher. Nico's worn face, the father's ragged clothes, and the thin sheen of sweat on Elias's brow. The storm's lingering gloom outside seemed determined to press in on them. For the moment, all that mattered was keeping Jonas stable and warm. Once they were certain he wouldn't go into shock, Elias would figure out a plan. Maybe he could attempt the trek to the closest settlement and see if anyone there could help. But the journey, even in optimal weather, would be perilous. By nightfall, Jonas had still not regained proper consciousness, though his eyelids fluttered occasionally, and once he murmured something that sounded like Nico. The boy stayed by his side, refusing Elias's suggestion to rest. At one point, Elias managed to coax Nico to eat a little more salted fish and some stale bread. Between mouthfuls, Nico asked question after question about the forest, about how Elias lived. The curiosity was natural, Elias supposed, given that few children ever ventured this deep. In halting sentences, Elias told him about the small garden plot behind the cabin when it wasn't drowned by endless rain, and how he collected mushrooms in a hollow log down by the creek. Nico listened with rapt attention, as if absorbing the details of a world he never knew existed. Elias found himself speaking more words that night than he had in the entire previous year. Still, an uneasy feeling haunted him. Nico needed better food, Jonas needed proper medical attention, and they had no means of calling for help. The father's phone was nowhere to be found when Elias searched the wreck earlier. Elias's old flip phone had died years ago, and no signal reached these hills anyway. In the city, an ambulance would have arrived within minutes of any call, but here they were alone with the raw reality of the wilderness. Tending to his unexpected guests, Elias remembered the city's beeping machines and bright neon signs. The memory made him shudder. Perhaps that world had advanced in certain ways, yet none of it could reach them now. Late in the evening, when the rain subsided to a faint drizzle, Nico sat on the floor next to his father, arms wrapped around his knees. "Thank you for helping us," he said quietly. Elias, standing by the fireplace, nodded once. "I'm glad I heard you crying out last night," he replied, unsure how to handle expressions of gratitude. Nico stroked his father's hand, gaze far away. "We were going to meet someone," the boy offered, voice trembling. "Dad said it was important, but we got lost. Then the storm came out of nowhere." Elias hesitated before asking, "Were you traveling far?" Nico shrugged. "I think so. Dad didn't tell me much, just that we had to leave the old place quickly." Worry rippled across his young face, but he didn't elaborate. Elias sensed there was more to the story but refused to pry. A child's life had enough burdens without an interrogation. That night, Elias again offered his bed to the boy, though Nico insisted on sleeping on the floor next to his father. Finally, Elias placed a blanket there, repositioning Jonas to rest on a makeshift pallet by the hearth. If Jonas stirred, Nico would be the first to know. Elias folded his long limbs into the rickety chair, exhaustion threatening to knock him out completely. But sleep proved elusive. His mind raced with plans he wasn't fully qualified to make, wondering how to feed 3 mouths, how to stop infection from setting in Jonas's leg, how to find a way back to civilization. Soft snores eventually rose from Nico while Jonas's breathing stayed uneven, punctuated by occasional moans. The wind outside remained subdued, the hush interrupted only by droplets hitting the tin roof. At some point, Elias drifted into a fitful doze. He dreamed of the city he had abandoned, the cold glint of steel towers, and the pitying looks of neighbors who thought he was worthless after the factory closed. The dream shifted to a memory of him rummaging in dusty cupboards for a few coins, desperate to pay overdue bills. Then, in a confusing swirl, he was in the forest, chasing after a lost child's cry. But every time he reached for the child, the boy vanished into the mist. When he jerked awake, heart pounding, he realized morning light was staining the shutters gray once more. On the floor, Nico was still curled by his father's side, though Jonas's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. Elias rose carefully, grabbing a fresh cloth to dampen with water. "Try not to move," he said, stepping closer to Jonas. The man blinked, turning his head slightly. "Nico," he rasped. Elias crouched. "He's safe, sleeping right here." Jonas swallowed hard, seeming both relieved and bewildered. "Who are you?" he managed, voice cracking from thirst. Elias handed him a small cup of water. "A stranger," he said simply, "but one who found your son in the storm." Jonas let the water slide down his throat with visible effort. Then he sighed, expression torn between gratitude and residual fear. "Thank you," he whispered, closing his eyes again as if the effort of speaking was too much. Elias stayed by his side, washing away some of the grime clinging to Jonas's face, the corners of his lips. They might be strangers, but in that moment Elias felt responsible for Jonas's every labored breath. Something inside him, a spark of empathy he thought had died, pulsed with fierce determination to keep this fragile new bond alive. Nico stirred awake not long after, blinking in confusion as the cabin's dim light offered little sense of time. Spotting his father's open eyes, the boy rushed over, relief breaking across his features. "Dad," he whispered, kneeling at the makeshift pallet. Jonas turned his head a fraction and attempted a weak smile. "Hey, bud," he murmured, voice still raspy. His gaze flicked to Elias, standing behind Nico, and for a moment he seemed unsure whether to fear or trust this tall stranger. But the concern etched in Elias's brow, along with Nico's obvious ease around him, must have softened Jonas's initial uncertainty. His shoulders relaxed, though his face still creased with pain. Elias cleared his throat, painfully aware of how unused to conversation he'd become. "We should try to clean and redress the wound on your leg," he said, nodding toward the crudely bandaged splint. Jonas gave a slight nod, then breathed out slowly, as if readying himself for agony. Nico bit his lip. "I'll help," the boy offered, wringing his hands in an attempt to show courage. Elias hesitated, then moved gently around them, easing Jonas's leg into a better position. Jonas's exhalation caught as his leg throbbed, but he held as still as he could. The process was slow and nerve-wracking. With Nico holding the cloth and Elias retying the strips, they managed to inspect the break. Elias let out a quiet sigh of relief. No obvious signs of infection. Yet the swelling around Jonas's calf alarmed him. It would require more expert care, maybe surgery. He recalled vague knowledge from an old medical textbook he'd once leafed through. Broken bones in remote areas posed constant threats of blood clots and permanent damage. The realization sent a cold knot twisting in his stomach, but he kept his face impassive for the boy's sake. With the leg settled, Elias offered Jonas some water to sip, then rummaged for whatever meager provisions he could spare for breakfast. A handful of dried berries, the last of his salted fish, and a small wedge of hard cheese, altogether pitiful, but it would have to do. Nico took it gratefully, dividing the portions between himself and his father. Elias watched, brow furrowing as he mentally calculated the rations. If Jonas started to regain strength, his appetite would grow, and Elias's food stores were already near empty. He might forage, but the persistent rain and the fact that he hadn't stocked up for 2 extra mouths loomed in his mind like a gathering shadow. An unspoken question hovered between them. What next? Though Jonas could speak in hushed tones, he remained too weak for a proper discussion, and Elias wasn't used to probing for information. Finally, Nico broke the silence, raising the query that haunted all three. "Will we be able to go home?" The boy's voice quivered. He seemed to regret asking it aloud, as if it made the answer too real. Elias exchanged a glance with Jonas, whose face looked pained but resolute. "Son, we might have to stay here a while, at least until I can move better." His voice cracked on the words, and he had to pause to gather strength. Then he looked directly at Elias. "If you'll allow us." Elias dipped his head in what might have been a nod. It felt oddly liberating and terrifying all at once, letting someone inside his lonely domain. But how could he deny them shelter? "Of course," he said softly. "We'll figure it out." Nico exhaled, relief mingled with uncertainty. Standing at the side, Elias sensed a wave of long-buried guilt lapping at his consciousness. He remembered how he had promised himself never to let another person breach his solitude, never again to shoulder the weight of someone else's well-being. Now, this family, father and son, had entered his life with the urgency of an avalanche, forcing him to confront the barriers he'd erected. Despite Jonas's evident exhaustion, Elias sensed the man's gratitude. It showed in small gestures, the way Jonas's eyes followed Elias's movements, silently acknowledging the cabin's warmth and the effort it took to bring him there. And at times, Elias noticed a flicker of curiosity in Jonas's expression, as though he wanted to ask how someone ends up living alone in a place so unforgiving. Yet he held back, likely out of caution or simple fatigue. Midday arrived, bringing little brightness to the forest. The storm clouds loomed overhead, and the perpetual drizzle cast everything in a gray pall. Elias decided he couldn't wait any longer. They needed more food, more firewood, and possibly herbs to help with Jonas's swelling. He donned his threadbare coat, then paused by the table where Jonas rested. "I have to go out," Elias told him. "Nico can stay here to look after you. I'll be back before nightfall." Jonas nodded, relief and worry mingling on his face. Nico's eyes flashed with apprehension, but the boy had seen how Elias returned from the woods once before and seemed to cling to that proof he could do it again. The wind was cold and sharp against Elias's skin as soon as he stepped outside. The path behind the cabin, though muddy, was one of the few routes he knew well. Tall pines stood like silent sentinels, dripping with rainwater. He carried a small satchel over his shoulder, intending to gather mushrooms, roots, and whatever else might help sustain them. The forest always had its secrets, if one knew where to look. With practiced motions, Elias checked the bases of fallen logs for edible fungi. In less soggy months, he could find berries or even wild onions in certain patches, but this perpetual dampness made it harder. Still, he managed to accumulate a modest collection of mushrooms and a few herbs. He took care identifying them, recalling the year he accidentally boiled a poisonous variety and was ill for days. It reminded him just how unforgiving nature could be. He also gathered small branches and sticks, enough for kindling, while keeping an eye out for signs of game. Deer tracks were sparse this high in the hills, and smaller creatures like rabbits had retreated to hidden burrows. He would need to set a few snares if the weather allowed. A flicker of memory. Long ago, he'd tried to fish in the stream that snaked through the ravine. Maybe he could rig a makeshift line if the water wasn't too wild from the recent storm. He exhaled sharply. It felt odd to think of gathering supplies for more than just himself. Each time he remembered Jonas's pained face and Nico's frightened eyes, a knot tightened in his chest. The feeling unsettled him, yet also lent him resolve. By late afternoon, he approached the ravine, gingerly stepping around rocks made slick by the drizzle. He spotted the stream coursing between mossy banks. Though it ran higher than usual, he thought it might be possible to cast a line in a calmer bend. He rummaged for a coil of thread he kept in his pocket and tied on a tiny hook carved from a bent nail. Using a bit of cloth as bait, he lowered it into the rushing water. The cold wind cut through his coat as he crouched there, silently waiting, the same patience he'd acquired through these lonely years now serving a more pressing need. He caught 2 small trout within an hour. It wasn't much, but it was fresh and would supplement their limited rations. Carefully, he cleaned the fish on a flat rock, then placed them in his satchel, feeling the biting chill creep into his fingers. The light was fading fast. He gathered his load of forage supplies and began the trek back. Normally, returning to the cabin meant simple relief. Elias alone again with his safe, predictable routines. Now he found himself hurrying, strangely eager to confirm Nico and Jonas were all right. When he finally pushed open the cabin door, darkness had gathered outside. Inside, the air was slightly smoky from the fire and the space felt warmer than usual. Nico jumped up from a stool near his father, eyes brightening as Elias entered. Jonas, though pale, was awake, and the flicker of recognition that crossed his features almost looked like a welcome. "You made it," he said softly, voice tinged with gratitude. Elias nodded, shrugging off his sodden coat. "I found a bit of food." He laid out the mushrooms, herbs, and fish. The boy's eyes widened in excitement. "Real fish?" Nico breathed. Elias forced a brief smile. "I'll cook it. It'll be simple." He felt oddly self-conscious, as though preparing a meal for guests he never invited yet desperately wanted to care for. In silence, he cleaned the mushrooms, set them to simmer in a battered pot with water and the herbs, then rigged a small spit over the fire for the trout. The smell of sizzling fish soon filled the cramped cabin, mingling with the earthy aroma of boiling mushrooms. Jonas asked a few pointed questions: where Elias found the fish, how the forest looked after the storm, but Elias responded only with brief, direct answers, still finding it difficult to maintain conversation. A nod here, a one-line response there. He sensed Jonas was holding back deeper inquiries, likely out of respect for Elias's guarded manner. Before long, they had a modest meal. Elias ladled mushroom broth into tin cups, tearing off chunks of the cooked trout. Nico and Jonas ate with a hunger that made Elias's chest tighten. It had probably been a day or more since they had a proper meal. Nico flashed him a tiny grin, the kind that comes from relief rather than joy. "Thank you," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Jonas echoed the sentiment, staring into the steaming cup as though it were a miracle. After supper, Elias helped Jonas shift position so he could rest more comfortably. Jonas winced but managed to lean against a stack of blankets. The boy, as usual, stayed close, reluctant to let his father out of arm's reach. For a moment, the three of them sat in a hush, broken only by the fire's crackle and the soft patter of rain returning. Elias realized with sudden surprise that he no longer felt stifled by the silence. There was something comforting about it now, an unspoken bond forming amid the gloom. As the hour grew late, Nico yawned, eyelids drooping. Elias guided the boy to the bed and insisted he sleep properly. "But Dad," Nico began, only to be cut off when Jonas said gently, "I'll be fine, son. Really." With Nico finally dozing on the bed, Elias settled back into his chair. Jonas gazed into the fire, and Elias caught a flicker of deep worry in his eyes. After a few moments, Jonas swallowed hard. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," he whispered. Elias stared at the glowing embers. Repayment felt like a foreign concept. He had done what was necessary, nothing more. "We'll see," he said softly. "For now, just heal." From the moment dawn crept through the shuttered windows, Elias sensed that tension in the cabin had grown. The rain still came in fits and starts, rattling the roof as though reminding them it was never far off. But a mild break in the weather offered a chance for clarity. Jonas had slept uneasily, waking more often with low groans. Though Elias had tried his best to redress the splint, the swelling in Jonas's leg seemed to worsen. Nico hovered nearby with anxious eyes, no longer hiding his concern. When Elias ventured outside to gather more firewood, he realized how precarious their situation was becoming. Pockets of stagnant rainwater made the ground slick, and a wind colder than any previous autumn wind whistled past the tall pines. 5 years of isolation had taught Elias to read the forest moods, and now it spoke of an early winter creeping in. A few stunted mushrooms clung to rotting logs, but for the most part, the best of the foraging season had already passed. Gnarled roots poked out of the soil, and he noted how the sky's deep gray showed no hint of sunshine. If Jonas's condition demanded urgent help, traveling to the nearest settlement would be risky even for an experienced hiker, especially if the weather deteriorated again. By the time he returned to the cabin, arms loaded with damp wood, he found Nico supporting his father while Jonas tried to sip water. The man's face was drawn with pain, his brow slick with sweat. Elias set down the wood and approached, noticing the tremor in Jonas's hand. "It's getting worse," Jonas said quietly, a confession laced with frustration. "My leg, I can hardly feel my foot at times, and when I do, it's just throbbing." Elias pressed a palm gently against the swollen calf. Even through the bandages, he felt the heat of inflammation. Worry gnawed at him. "We need real treatment," he said bluntly. Jonas managed a ghost of a smile. "That's an understatement." Nico tensed, scanning Elias's face. "You can help him, right?" the boy asked, as though clinging to the hope that Elias could do anything. Elias let out a slow breath. Lying would be cruel. "I've done all I can with what I have here. We need medicine and a doctor. The roads, well, they aren't exactly roads anymore, but there might be a chance if I set out on foot. Maybe I can find someone to come back with me, or at least get some supplies. Jonas looked aghast. That's 20 miles or more, isn't it? And under these conditions? Elias shrugged. Yes, but there might be a hamlet or an outpost where passing traders gather. At times I've seen a logging crew down the ridge. If they're still around, they might have a truck or a radio. He glanced at Nico, whose expression had grown taut. You'd stay here with your father, of course. I can't risk bringing you both through that terrain. Jonas opened his mouth to protest, but he didn't have the strength. If that's the only option, he murmured. A wave of guilt flickered in Elias's chest. He remembered how the city had let him slip away, jobless and abandoned, how easy it was to be forgotten by society's constant churn. Now he was about to leave a wounded man and a child in a creaking cabin. But was there a choice? The alternative was to watch Jonas's condition deteriorate. I'll gather what supplies I can, Elias said, trying to sound confident. I'll leave tomorrow at first light. Tonight, I'll show Nico how to keep the fire going and how to fetch water from the rain barrel. I won't be gone longer than I have to. Nico swallowed hard, glancing at his father. I'll do whatever I need to, he said with a shaky determination. Jonas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, eyes reflecting both gratitude and dread. That evening, Elias spent hours rummaging through the cabin for anything that might help on the journey. He located an old compass, battered but still functional, and a coil of thin rope. His spare coat was worn to the threads, yet he might use an extra layer of blankets if he had to spend nights outdoors. He also carved a sturdy walking stick from a broken shovel handle. Each move felt surreal. He had not ventured beyond a few miles of this place for nearly half a decade. Over supper, a grimly rationed mix of leftover fish and boiled roots, they discussed the plan. Jonas insisted on giving Elias a slip of paper from his coat pocket, where an address was scribbled in smeared ink. It's someone I know, a friend, Jonas managed. If you reach a phone or a place with service, call this number. Tell him we got stranded. He'll understand. Elias tucked it away, uncertain if phone coverage existed anywhere in these remote hills, but acknowledging the gesture. Once Nico had settled in to sleep, Elias sat by the hearth with Jonas. The injured man's leg was propped on folded blankets. Periodically, he pressed his lips together to stifle a groan. Elias poked at the fire, the gentle crackle of burning pine the only sound for a while. Finally, Jonas spoke, voice subdued. I don't know what drove you out here, and it's not my place to pry, but you're doing more for us than any stranger would. I won't forget it. Elias stared into the flames, recalling old humiliations that had once defined him. Maybe I forgot how to be around people, he admitted after a moment, but I never forgot what it means to help, not when someone truly needs it. He expected Jonas to press further, but the man merely nodded, wincing slightly as he did. Elias recognized that Jonas was too weak for extended conversation. He helped him shift position again, double-checked the splint, and made sure the bandage was still clean. Then, as Jonas drifted into a fitful sleep, Elias mentally rehearsed the route he would take the next morning. Night settled in. Nico slept curled near his father, while Elias rolled out a mat on the floor. He closed his eyes, but images came unbidden. Rain-lashed roads, twisted roots catching his ankles, or the memory of how he once fled the city in shame. He heard the faint whistle of the wind outside, and behind that, the soft stir of Jonas's uneasy breathing. At some point, Elias slipped into a restless slumber. When he rose before dawn, no one else was awake. He moved about quietly, packing his satchel with a few meager provisions, the last handful of dried berries, a small piece of leftover fish. He filled a tin canteen with rainwater from the barrel, then fastened it to his belt. As he shrugged into his coat, he noticed Nico stirring. The boy rubbed his eyes and stood, crossing the cabin in hushed steps. You're leaving now? he asked, voice thick with sleep. Elias nodded. The earlier I start, the better chance of finding help soon. Nico's eyes flitted to where Jonas lay. Will he be okay? I've shown you how to keep the fire alive, Elias said. Make sure he drinks water, eats a bit when he can, change the bandage if it gets too dirty. I'll do everything I can to return quickly, maybe with a doctor or a truck. Nico's lips trembled, but he clutched his father's jacket for courage. Okay. I promise I won't let the fire die. Elias pressed a hand to the boy's shoulder, an unexpected wave of affection rising in him. He almost said something more, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he managed a faint smile and slipped outside. The sky was a lightless gray, the forest swathed in morning mist so thick Elias could scarcely see a few yards ahead. He clicked on his flashlight, picking his way down the slope where the logging road once wound. Mud clung to his boots in heavy clumps. With each step, he kept thinking of Jonas and Nico, alone in the cabin. Wards he'd never asked for, yet whose safety now weighed on him like an oath. The logging road had collapsed in multiple places, rock slides forming barricades of rubble. Occasionally, Elias found footprints or old tire tracks, which gave him some sense of direction, but mostly he navigated by memory and the battered compass in his hand. Time lost meaning. The mist pressed in from all sides, and drizzle turned to a steady rain, then back to drizzle. Elias trekked across terrain littered with downed branches and decaying leaves. Twice he stumbled into hidden puddles, drenching his trouser legs. He paused only long enough to sip water from his canteen, then pushed forward. The hum of a distant waterfall reminded him of a landmark that lay to the west. He used that sound to correct his course, determined not to veer off track. After several hours, the sky brightened, though it remained overcast. Elias's breath came in ragged puffs, and a dull ache radiated through his shoulders and calves. Yet he pressed on, recalling that each hour lost meant Jonas's fever might rise another degree, or Nico's anxious watch might strain him further. He tried not to imagine more storms rolling in, trapping him out here, but the thought lurked in the back of his mind. Around midday, the rugged path veered into a narrower pass flanked by steep inclines. With no open vantage, Elias found it harder to gauge direction by the sun's position. At one point, the path split, one way descending to a waterlogged hollow, the other climbing over loose scree. He chose the higher route, hoping to avoid sinking into the bog. Rocks shifted underfoot, sending small cascades of pebbles rattling downhill. The wind picked up, slicing through his coat. Soon his toes went numb from cold, and the rope around his shoulder grew slick with rainwater. He pressed onward, jaws set, reminding himself that somewhere beyond these ridges lay a scattering of hamlets, and he hoped, help. By late afternoon, clouds stretched ominously across the horizon. Elias guessed he might have covered half the distance needed, but everything looked so different in the gloom. The forest no longer felt like the realm he'd grown accustomed to. It was darker, almost predatory. He pictured Jonas lying helpless, the boy valiantly tending to the fire. A pang of desperation prodded him to keep moving, even as exhaustion tugged at his limbs. At last, in the faint evening light, he spotted an overhang, a shallow cave carved into the rock. Taking shelter there would allow him to rest without being hammered by wind and rain. He ducked inside, found a relatively dry corner, and dropped onto the stone floor. Every muscle throbbed. Unwrapping a bit of the fish from a cloth, he forced himself to eat. The taste was briny, the texture stringy, but it gave him a meager boost of energy. Outside, the wind whistled louder, as if angered by his small moment of respite. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing around the tightness in his throat. This trek, he realized, might take longer than he predicted, and Jonas's condition could deteriorate fast. He forced himself to remain calm. If it took 2 days, so be it. He refused to imagine failure. The father and son had placed their hope in him, and for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he felt a fierce determination to deliver. So he hunched there in the darkening cave, listening to the wind moan through the pines. Fear hovered at the edges of his mind, whispering that he was too late, that storms would trap him, that he'd only return to find sorrow. But with quiet resolve, Elias steadied his breathing, bracing himself for the next stage of the journey. Elias woke stiff and cold, curled against the rocky wall of the shallow cave. Outside, the wind still prowled, rattling branches in the gloom. He rubbed his eyes, momentarily disoriented, until the memories of why he was there rolled back into focus. Jonas's broken leg, Nico's frightened resolve, and the pressing need to find help. Stretching his cramped limbs, he realized he must have slept only a few hours. A gnawing hunger reminded him that the meager rations in his satchel were almost gone. Still, he dared not linger. He had promised to return with supplies, perhaps with a doctor or rescue vehicle. Every delay made that hope feel more fragile. He stepped out into the pale, misty dawn, shivering as wet needles of wind cut through his coat. The rocky path wound downward, lined by debris from recent storms. Rain puddles and loose gravel forced each step to be deliberate. He tried to recall whether the old logging route continued along this ridge or descended into a ravine. Either path carried potential danger, but at least the drizzle had momentarily ceased, leaving behind a hushed stillness broken only by the scuffling of his boots and the occasional caw of distant crows. As he trudged forward, Elias couldn't help replaying glimpses of his old life in the city. He remembered the final week at the factory, how the managers announced sudden closure, leaving dozens jobless overnight. He saw again the heartbreak on his fiance's face when their savings vanished and bills stacked high. He recalled how each rejection letter, each unreturned job application had chipped away at his pride, and then, worst of all, her voice, trembling with pity, telling him she couldn't share in his bitterness any longer. His flight to this wilderness felt like a coward's choice back then, yet now, ironically, that choice made him the only person capable of saving Jonas and Nico. The thought nudged him onward, even when the trail demanded caution. By late morning, he reached a narrow clearing overlooking a plunging valley. Beyond the lumpy fog, he spotted a thin line of what might have been a road, or perhaps just a dry creek bed. It was impossible to tell at this distance. Still, he decided to descend. If any hamlet stood a chance of existing in these parts, it would be at lower elevation. He inched down a precarious slope slicked with mud, clinging to saplings for balance. Twice he lost his footing and slid painfully until a jutting rock or outstretched branch halted his fall. Each time he forced himself upright, ignoring bruises and the sting in his palms. When he finally reached flatter ground, the clouds had begun to muster again. The wind whipped fallen leaves around him in a frantic dance. Elias scanned the terrain until a faint outline emerged among the trees. A dilapidated structure, perhaps an abandoned shack or outpost. His heart gave a small leap. Any shelter might hold clues, even if it was just leftover supplies or a long-discarded map. He approached with caution, noticing shards of broken glass in a window frame. The door hung askew, battered by the elements. Stepping inside, he found a single cramped room littered with damp magazines, splintered furniture, and a rusted stove. A forlorn smell of rot and mold filled the place. He rummaged through the debris, hoping to find something useful. A scattering of empty cans suggested whoever once lived here left in a hurry. No food, no medical kit, not even a tattered blanket that wasn't eaten by mildew. But in a corner he discovered a wooden crate containing a few lengths of rope and a sturdy lantern. The lantern's glass was cracked, yet the base seemed intact. He pried it open and shook it. There was still a trace of fuel. It might help if he had to travel at night. He also found a box of matches, sealed in plastic that had thankfully kept them dry. Elias took what he could carry, then ventured outside. The sky was darkening again, though it was barely midday, and the hush in the air felt ominous. He looked east, certain the settlement, if it still existed, lay in that direction. The forest thickened there, tangles of pine and cedar forming a looming barrier. He inhaled sharply, then started forward. Jonas's leg might not allow him many days before infection took hold, and that knowledge provided a grim push whenever his knees trembled from fatigue. Meanwhile, miles away in the cramped cabin, Nico knelt beside the hearth, carefully adding another log to keep the flames high. Jonas reclined against folded blankets, sweat beading his forehead. His leg throbbed with unrelenting ache, and he fought the urge to gasp whenever a fresh jolt of pain shot through him. He caught sight of his son's pinched expression and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fire's looking good," he managed. Nico nodded, poking the embers gently. "Elias told me to keep it hot," the boy said. "That way you won't be cold." Jonas gave an appreciative hum. "You're doing great, buddy." Inside, though, worry twisted. He had no idea if Elias would find help or how long the journey would take. They had enough water. Rain barrels overflowed here, but food was another matter. His appetite flickered, overshadowed by pain. Yet he forced himself to nibble on the last scraps of fish, not wanting to show weakness in front of Nico. Each swallow felt hollow, as if no amount of nourishment could mask the dread blossoming in his gut. Occasionally, Nico stared at his father with anxious eyes, then at the door as though expecting Elias to walk in at any moment. After all, Nico was just a kid, thrust into a survival scenario he never asked for. Jonas felt the sting of guilt, recalling how his desperation to flee their old life landed them in this predicament. He tried not to dwell on the details that had prompted their rushed departure, but they loomed nonetheless. Money owed, favors called in too often, unsavory men who asked for repayment faster than he could manage. Now, all those troubles seemed trivial compared to the immediate threat of Jonas's failing body. His leg burned from hip to ankle, a constant reminder of how fragile the human body could be against nature's harshness. At times the cabin blurred, and he worried fever might be setting in. To distract himself, Jonas asked Nico about anything he could think of. Favorite subjects at school, the treehouse they had once planned to build, silly jokes from years past. The boy tried to answer enthusiastically, but his voice cracked under the weight of responsibility. Eventually, they both lapsed into a somber hush, lulled by the flicker of flames. Outside, a fresh volley of rain drummed against the roof, and the wind hissed through gaps in the logs. Jonas closed his eyes, imagining Elias forging through that deluge alone. He didn't know what was more frightening, the possibility that Elias might fail to find help, or the thought that Elias might never return at all. Clinging to a shred of hope, Jonas whispered a silent plea to any higher power that might listen. "Don't let me die here. Don't let my son be stranded in this wilderness." The storm eventually abated, leaving a gray, humid gloom. Nico fussed over the fire, then rummaged through the cabin for anything that could serve as bandages. He found a few strips of cloth that Elias had set aside, along with a stub of soap. Jonas did his best to keep his voice steady as Nico unwound the old bandage around the splint. The swelling had spread, discoloring the skin. The boy's lip trembled, but he said nothing, diligently cleaning the area as Elias had shown him. Jonas bit back cries of pain, not wanting to frighten Nico further. When the boy finally tied a fresh piece of cloth around the makeshift splint, Jonas slumped back, breathing hard. "Thank you," he managed, voice hoarse. Nico nodded, tears glistening at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. In the forest, Elias pushed through a wall of thorny undergrowth, cursing under his breath as brambles scratched his arms. Each time he thought the land might slope toward civilization, the terrain twisted unexpectedly. Shadows lengthened, telling him the day was waning. But he had made insufficient progress. A raw frustration boiled up inside him, mingling with the physical exhaustion. He'd abandoned the logging road when it vanished under a rock slide, forced to rely on guesswork and old memory. At one point, he glimpsed a faint sign, Woodfell Camp, painted on a rusted metal plaque attached to a post. Hope flared, then dimmed when the path beyond it crumbled into a mud-filled gorge. Woodfell Camp might still be operational, or it might be yet another relic from better days. Nightfall approached, pressing Elias to find shelter again or risk being caught in the open. He spotted a cluster of pine trees forming a natural canopy, their branches interlocked overhead. The ground beneath them, though moist, at least offered some refuge from direct rain. He gathered fallen needles and branches, building a rudimentary bed, then used the lantern he'd salvaged to create a faint circle of light. The small flame danced in the cracked glass, revealing the stiff set of his jaw. He replayed the events that led him here. 5 years lost in bitterness, now forced back into a role he'd long abandoned. Someone who took initiative, who tried to save others. It felt both daunting and unexpectedly right. Hunger gnawed at him again, but he had little left besides a single piece of dried mushroom. Sighing, he chewed it slowly, wincing at the bland, earthy taste. Outside, the wind grew restless, shaking the treetops until the needles quivered. Elias pulled the blanket around himself, glancing at the dark beyond his flickering lantern. In his lonely years, he had grown accustomed to the forest's nightly concert. Yet now, it felt menacing. If something happened to him out here, Jonas and Nico would be lost. That awareness pressed on him like an invisible weight, but also fueled a spark of courage. He leaned back against a trunk, letting his eyes close for a moment. Jonas's face, pale and drawn, drifted across his mind, followed by the fragile determination in Nico's gaze. Elias imagined them in the cabin, tending the fire, waiting. That quiet trust the boy showed him was new, something Elias barely knew how to handle. But it carried a flicker of warmth that cut through the darkness. If he had once doubted his worth, the mere fact that two people now depended on him made him feel oddly alive. Dawn arrived as a pale sheen behind the twisted treetops, revealing a sky crowded with churning clouds. Elias woke to stiff muscles and the distant drum of water dripping from saturated leaves. He rubbed his eyes and surveyed his makeshift camp beneath the pines. His lantern had long since sputtered out, leaving only damp gloom. Despite the hunger gnawing at his belly and the bone-deep weariness, he forced himself to his feet. The memory of Nico and Jonas, alone in the cabin, flared like a beacon urging him onward. He shook off the dead needles clinging to his coat and resumed the trek east, clambering over uprooted stumps and loose rocks, hoping for any sign of civilization. It took him another hour of arduous hiking before the pines thinned into patches of younger saplings. Through the swirling mist, he spotted remnants of an old gravel road, a strip of broken stones winding between leaning fence posts. Relief flickered through him at the sight, tempered by caution. Wherever this path led, it might be deserted. Still, it was better than aimless wandering through brambles. He quickened his pace, ignoring the sharp protest in his calves. Each step came with an unspoken prayer that the path would guide him to living souls, perhaps a camp or even a single farmhouse where a vehicle could be found. As he walked, a faint memory surfaced, a passing remark from the locals during his early days in the cabin. Something about a retired logger living deep in these woods, an old man rumored to have a radio or generator. Elias had dismissed such rumors at the time, too consumed by his own withdrawal from humanity. Now he latched onto that half-forgotten tale. If it were true, there might be a chance to reach help more quickly than stumbling all the way to a distant settlement. The road's conditions suggested minimal use. so perhaps it ended at some solitary dwelling. He pressed on. After another bend, a clearing emerged, ringed by cedar trees bowing in the wind. At the far edge stood a low structure, wooden walls patched with sheets of tin, a roof crowned by a battered chimney. Smoke rose from that chimney in thin wisps, visible even in the drab sky. Elias felt an instant wave of relief. Where there was smoke, there had to be someone. Squaring his shoulders, he followed the gravel until it ended in a small courtyard of packed dirt. 2 dogs barked from the side, their hackles rising at the sight of a stranger. A figure in a muddy coat emerged, holding a shovel. Elderly but tough, with wiry arms and a face etched by decades of labor. He shouted something Elias couldn't immediately parse, the dogs circling warily. Elias lifted his hands in a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat. "I need help," he called, voice cracking from disuse and desperation. "My friend is injured, broken leg. We have a child with him. I need a phone or a radio." The old man eyed him with open suspicion, then whistled sharply. At once the dogs relaxed, slinking back toward the porch. "You lost?" he asked, voice gruff but not unkind. Elias swallowed, stepping forward as the man eased his shovel aside. "I've been living farther up in the hills," Elias replied, "but now I need to get to a doctor. My friend is hurt bad. Please tell me you can contact someone." The old man exhaled, the lines on his face deepening. "Not a phone, but I've got a CB radio. Works if the generator cooperates." Elias felt a burst of hope. Even if it was a long shot, a functioning radio might connect them to someone with a truck or medical supplies. The man jerked his head toward the shack. "Come on then, before you freeze. Name's Emery." Elias followed, thankful to be out of the wind. Inside, the place was cramped, smelling of old coffee and wet dog. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and workshop. In a corner, a battered table held a large radio unit connected to a mess of cables. Emery stomped across the worn floorboards to a portable generator, giving it a few vigorous pulls until it coughed to life. The overhead bulb flickered, then steadied into a weak glow. "You sure picked a fine time to roam these parts," Emery commented, eyeing Elias's waterlogged coat. "Storm season's worse this year. Rock slides everywhere." Elias nodded grimly, cutting straight to the point. "We have minimal food, no medicine. The man's feverish, and it's his leg that worries me most. The bone might be broken in more than one place." Emery grunted, fiddling with the dials on the radio. "Folks around here usually contact the ranger station if they're in trouble, but that's half a county away. Lately we get a passing plane that monitors these frequencies once a day. Maybe we'll get lucky." While Emery tinkered, Elias glanced around. The dogs had followed them indoors, settling near a rusting wood stove for warmth, occasionally glancing at Elias with uncertain curiosity. Old photographs hung on one wall, showing a younger Emery with a logging crew in front of massive felled trees. A pang of recognition flickered through Elias as he recognized certain slopes in the background. The same forest, but from an era of heavier industry. "Where exactly is your friend?" Emery asked over his shoulder, turning a knob. Elias described the route in rough detail, explaining the condition of the trails and the approximate location of his cabin. Emery gave a low whistle. "That's a long haul, especially for somebody with a broken leg. The roads are half gone up that way." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made Elias's heart leap. Emery leaned in, pressing a button. "This is Emery Turner at the old sawmill shack, calling for any station picking up this signal. Over." White noise, then a faint hiss. Emery repeated the call, adjusting frequencies. Elias waited, pulse thrumming. After a moment, a voice crackled back, broken by static. "Emery, that you? Over." Emery flashed Elias a triumphant look. "Sure is. Listen, we've got an emergency. Injured man in the high hills might need evacuation. The voice, muffled but urgent, replied in bursts. Elias caught fragments. Weathers, chopper, maybe tomorrow, Rangers. Emery's shoulders sagged. He pressed the button again, glancing at Elias. Need details, son. They're saying they can contact a rescue team, but the earliest a helicopter could come is day after next, weather's messing their schedule. So best shot is if we can get a Ranger truck up there sooner. Elias's jaw tightened. A day after next might be too late. My friend's fever. He stopped, frustration choking him. Emery relayed the cabin's coordinates as best as Elias could provide. After several tense exchanges, the connection fizzled. Emery whacked the side of the radio, cursing softly. That's all we'll get now. They said they'd try to get word to the Rangers, see if they can breach that route. Roads are shot, but maybe a heavy-duty vehicle can push through, weather permitting. Elias slumped onto a stool, relief and dread mingling. Help might be coming, but it wasn't guaranteed, and precious hours would pass in the meantime. Emery rubbed his stubbled chin. We could try heading back ourselves, but with one old pickup truck in these roads, not sure we'd make it, especially not with all the rock slides. He eyed Elias appraisingly. But maybe if we pack some gear, medicine, food, a tent, one of us might get through on foot again. Elias's heart thumped. I'll go. I can guide you. At first, Emery looked ready to protest, but Elias continued, voice firm. I came this far alone. Another set of hands to carry supplies is all the better. Emery sighed, then nodded. Let's see what we've got that could help. They rummaged through battered crates in a small back room, stirring dust into the stale air. Emery produced a box of medical odds and ends, bandages, antiseptic wipes, painkillers well past their expiration date, and a battered splint for an arm, which might still be modified for a leg. Better than nothing, Emery commented, his voice softening for the first time. Sorry it's not new. Times are hard out here. Elias shook his head, grateful for any resource. Next, they threw together food staples, canned beans, jerky, a few onions, and dried fruit. Emery insisted on giving Elias a sturdier coat, patched with mismatched fabric but lined with wool. Can't have you freezing out there, he said simply. By afternoon, they'd assembled enough gear to fill 2 backpacks. Emery made a quick meal of oatmeal on a portable stove, sharing it with Elias and the dogs. Then, with barely a word, they left the shack behind, forging west to retrace Elias's steps. Emery locked his door with a grim expression, as if aware this journey could be perilous. The dogs barked, expecting to join, but Emery waved them back. Stay, he ordered, voice firm. They whined but obeyed. They moved at a careful pace, Emery leading them along the few passable sections of road. Even so, they were forced to climb over fallen trunks, skirt gaping sinkholes, and navigate precarious mudslides. Elias realized that Emery's experience in these woods was invaluable. The older man pointed out hidden hazards, recognized where the ground might give way, and even recommended detours that Elias hadn't noticed on his solo trip. Still, the progress was grueling. By dusk, they managed only half the distance to Elias's old campsite. Searching for a suitable place to shelter, they found a rocky ledge under which they could pitch the small tent Emery carried. The wind had picked up again, swirling with biting rain. Inside the cramped tent, they huddled around a flickering flashlight. Emery's face, lined with age, reflected a sober concern. Hope we can make it tomorrow, he muttered, rummaging for a can of beans. Your friend's got to be in rough shape by now. Elias swallowed hard, picturing Jonas's feverish face, Nico's anxious determination, and the walls of the cabin battered by relentless downpours. He'll hold on, Elias said, forcing conviction into his words. He has to. Emery passed him a tin mug of tepid coffee, and they shared a quiet meal of canned beans and jerky, each lost in private worries. Rain pattered against the tent, an unrelenting reminder of how fragile their shelter was in the face of nature's fury. Yet Elias felt an odd spark of hope, something he never expected to feel after so many years hidden from the world. Strangers had answered his call for help, and now Emery, a man he'd only met that morning, was walking beside him to save Jonas. Perhaps trust was not as dead as Elias once believed. Maybe this wilderness, for all its cruelty, could still cradle acts of unexpected kindness. When they at last laid down to rest, Emery's soft snores soon filled the cramped space. Elias, however, lingered in a half-conscious state, listening to the wind moan through the trees. Memories of that silent cabin tugged at him, the flickering firelight on Jonas's pallid face, Nico's unwavering watch, the hush of 5 lonely years collapsing under the weight of human connection. A faint warmth settled in his chest, overshadowing the fear. When he closed his eyes, he pictured the child's hopeful gaze and Jonas's determined grimace, and he prayed to whatever forces might be listening that they would arrive in time. Morning came gray and cold. Rain clung to every leaf and needle, transforming the forest into a dripping labyrinth of hazy green. Inside the cramped tent, Elias woke first, his breath steaming in the chill air. Emery still slept, curled under a patched blanket, his brow knit in concern even in unconsciousness. The previous day's trek had tested them both, and now they faced another stretch of broken roads and steep inclines to reach the cabin. Elias thought of Jonas's fever, imagined Nico fighting back tears in the dim glow of the hearth, and felt urgency pound in his veins. He slowly unzipped the tent flap, peering out at the slick ground. The sky threatened a fresh deluge, clouds churning overhead. Still, the hush was momentarily peaceful, like a held breath before the storm resumed. Elias found a small, relatively dry spot beneath a cluster of pines to light a cautious fire for breakfast. He used the matches Emery provided, coaxing sparks into meager flames. The dampness made it a frustrating process, but a sliver of flame eventually caught on the tinder. By the time Emery emerged, yawning and rubbing his neck, a pot of water was beginning to warm. Elias nodded in greeting, silent as ever, though inside, he was grateful for this companion. Without Emery, the path back would be even more dangerous. Emery returned the nod, rummaging through a backpack for ration bars. The 2 men shared a muted meal of bland cereal squares and slurps of hot water, grateful for anything that staved off cold and hunger. With the tent collapsed and gear repacked, they set off along the ridges. Mist coiled between the trunks, and a gusty wind rattled the undergrowth. Emery led them around a spot where the earth had collapsed into a muddy sinkhole, muttering curses at the devastation nature had wrought. "Never seen it this bad," he said, voice low. "Rain's always hammered these parts, but the last 2 seasons, it's like the ground gave up." Elias listened, thinking of how the forest had become his silent home for 5 years, how even he'd never known it to be quite so treacherous. Yet he also recognized that no matter how punishing, the wilderness could reveal flickers of raw beauty, glossy green moss on a fallen trunk, the gentle hush of pines. That beauty felt overshadowed now by the weight of Jonas's plight, but Elias silently clung to the idea that perseverance could pay off here as it once had in simpler tasks. They navigated slow, each step chosen to avoid twisted roots or slick boulders. Several times, Emery checked the makeshift map in his head, gleaned from Elias's recollections of streams, rock formations, and directional hints. By midday, they paused to rest by a narrow creek that had swelled into a torrent, frothing between large stones. Emery squatted on one rock, panting, while Elias refilled canteens with frigid water. In the wind's roar, conversation felt futile. Only when they moved on did Emery speak again, half shouting over the rush. "If we're lucky, we'll reach your old campsite before dusk. Then maybe tomorrow we hit your cabin by midday." Elias grimaced. That meant Jonas and Nico would have endured 3 nights without further aid. He forced himself not to dwell on the worst scenarios, hoping that Jonas's fever could be managed with rest and the limited resources they had. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Nico was running out of ways to keep his father's mind off the pain. The boy had boiled water for a weak infusion of herbs Elias had left behind, hoping it would lower Jonas's temperature. But the results were minimal. Jonas lay propped against a pile of blankets, eyes half closed. Sweat matted his hair and a fresh wave of chills ran through him. Nico struggled to maintain composure, glancing at the window, as if he expected Elias to return at any moment with a miraculous cure. When Jonas stirred and muttered incoherently, Nico pressed a damp cloth to his father's forehead. "Dad," he whispered, voice trembling, "please stay awake. You have to hold on." Jonas managed to focus on the boy, forcing a shaky nod. "I'm trying," he breathed. The throbbing in his leg felt like a fire beneath his skin. Every so often, he drifted into half-sleep, tormented by nightmares of the crash, or of sinking into cold mud while Nico called for him. He'd wake with his pulse racing, unsure of where he was until he saw the flickering hearthlight and felt his son's small hand on his arm. In those moments, Jonas despised his weakness. He'd been the one to promise Nico safety, to vow they'd forge a better life away from the debts and threats that haunted them. Now a stranger had to rescue them both, while Jonas could do nothing but lie here and hope. By late afternoon, Jonas felt the fever rising again. Nico coaxed him to drink water, but Jonas's stomach churned and he barely managed a few gulps. Outside, the forest dimmed under low-hanging clouds, and the candle on the rough table provided faint illumination in the cabin's gloom. Nico had collected as much kindling as he could, piling it near the fire so it would stay dry. Each crackle of the flames offered a small comfort in the deafening silence. At one point, Jonas tried to reassure his son. "Elias, he'll bring help. We just have to wait." The statement echoed emptily, yet Nico nodded as if it were a solemn promise. That show of faith reminded Jonas that giving in to despair now would betray the trust his son needed to stay calm. Emery and Elias ended up making better time than expected, crossing a stretch of hillside that, though steep, wasn't as wrecked by landslides as other parts. Still, the light was fading when they finally approached the area Elias recognized as his previous night's campsite, a small clearing ringed by pines. Emery breathed out a sigh of relief. "We're on track then," he said, leaning on his walking stick. Elias gazed around, noticing the remains of the small fire he'd kindled 2 nights prior. Fatigue tugged at his limbs, yet seeing this familiar spot fueled a surge of determination. One more good day of travel and they'd reach the cabin. They settled in, erecting Emery's tent. The ground was sodden, but at least the gale had eased to a stiff breeze. Emery used a flint to spark the small stove, cooking a quick meal of canned soup. Steam curled in the frigid air, and Elias inched close, letting the warmth seep into his aching fingers. They ate in silence at first, the quiet overshadowed by their shared sense of urgency. After a while, Emery cleared his throat. "I used to hear rumors about a young man living alone in the high hills," he said, carefully neutral. "Didn't realize that was you." Elias stared into the tin cup, swallowing a mouthful of soup that tasted of salt and faint spice. "Probably was," he admitted. "I moved out here after losing my footing in the city." He spoke haltingly, uncertain why he felt compelled to explain, but Emery's calm presence and selfless assistance merited some honesty. So he recounted in clipped phrases how the factory closure had driven him into poverty, how shame and heartbreak destroyed his relationships, how a half-forgotten inheritance of a cabin became an escape. Emery listened, occasionally nodding, never once interrupting with judgment. "Well," Emery said quietly, after Elias finished, "life sure can knock a man around, but I've learned you can still find reasons to keep going, even when it feels like everything's crumbled." His gaze swept the dark forest. Hard to see it sometimes, but even these hills, battered as they are, keep on living. Elias realized that a year ago he might have dismissed such words, shutting out any suggestion of redemption. Now, with Jonas's life in peril and Nico's faith in him, it resonated like a distant echo of truth. The next day dawned with a muffled burst of thunder. They woke in the tent to see thick clouds pressing low, and within minutes of packing up, rain hammered down. No time to wait it out. They forged ahead, mud slipping under their boots, water trickling down the back of Elias's neck. If the cabin wasn't too far now, a few more hours might be enough to reach Jonas and Nico. Emery led them around fallen logs and chaotic debris, sometimes using his shovel to clear smaller slides. Step by punishing step, they climbed higher, the wind biting at their faces. At midday, they recognized a slope scattered with pine skeletons, a landmark Elias knew well, a lightning-scorched patch he once used to gather kindling. Relief rippled through him. The cabin lay only a few miles beyond that ridge. He quickened his pace, despite the fatigue in his thighs. Emery said nothing, simply matched Elias's stride, both men pushing hard. But the unrelenting rain made each footfall treacherous. Stones slid, patches of earth dissolved into murky puddles. At one point, Emery lost his footing on a slick rock and tumbled to one knee, sending the shovel clattering. Elias helped him up, ignoring his own shaking arms. Finally, the cabin's outline emerged through a haze of drizzle, standing sentinel amid dripping conifers. Elias felt an odd stutter in his chest, relief and dread colliding. Would Jonas still be hanging on? Was Nico safe? He didn't want to consider the alternative. He broke into a stumbling run, Emery following, the cold air stinging his lungs. Reaching the porch, Elias nearly slipped on the wet steps. He banged the door open. The interior lay dim, lit by embers in the fireplace. Nico scrambled upright from the stool, eyes widening with astonishment. "You're back," the boy cried, dropping the rag he held. His expression flicked from joy to urgency. "Dad's, he's so hot. I tried to—" Elias didn't wait for more details. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides, crouching beside Jonas, who lay almost unresponsive on a small pallet. His face was flushed red, lips dry, forehead beaded with perspiration. Elias touched Jonas's cheek and recoiled at the fever's heat. Emery stepped in, setting his backpack down, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. "We've got some supplies," he said gruffly. "Let's see what we can do." Nico stood off to the side, trying to keep composure even as tears brimmed. Elias guided the boy to a corner, speaking softly. "Help me get water boiling, lots of it. We'll try to reduce his temperature, clean the wound." While Nico rushed to the stove, Emery and Elias unpacked bandages, antiseptics, and painkillers. Jonas stirred, eyes flickering open. Recognition sparked, followed by relief. He tried to speak, but his voice came out in a dry rasp. Emery knelt, rummaging for a small bottle of antibiotic pills. "They're old," he muttered to Elias, "but might help keep infection down." Elias nodded, forcing Jonas to swallow one with a trickle of water. Then they cut away the old bandage, revealing inflamed skin around the makeshift splint. Emery's face grew grave. "We gotta cool that fever. Let's do compresses." Nico returned with hot water sloshing in a tin pot, eyes huge with fear. Emery carefully dipped cloths into the water, letting them cool to a safer temperature, then laid them on Jonas's forehead and chest. Elias crushed some of the dried herbs they'd brought, hoping it might soothe the pain or at least keep Jonas hydrated. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. For the next hour they worked in near silence, focusing on their tasks. cleaning the wound, resplinting the leg with sturdier materials Emery had packed, and administering water in small intervals. Jonas's breathing remained ragged, and at times he moaned in delirium. Still, color gradually returned to his cheeks, as if the combined effort was granting him a fighting chance. Finally, Emery leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "We can't do much more except wait for the rescue team or a truck," he said quietly. Elias nodded, exhausted. Nico perched at his father's side, carefully stroking Jonas's hand. Soft sobs escaped him then, tears trailing down his cheeks. Elias placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's stronger than he looks," Elias said, voice rough with emotion. "You did well, Nico. You kept him alive." Over the next hours, the cabin became a small fortress of careful vigilance. Nico stayed close by Jonas, keeping the compresses damp and cooling his father's forehead whenever his fever spiked. Emery took stock of the provisions they'd carried in, measuring out portions of dried fruit and jerky to ensure there was enough to keep everyone fed, at least for a few days. Elias flitted between tasks, tending the fire, boiling water, and checking the splint every so often. The relentless rain outside hammered the roof, pooling in muddy hollows that surrounded the cabin. Although the sound was monotonous, it somehow amplified the tension within those cramped walls. Jonas's fever ebbed slightly by nightfall, and he regained enough strength to speak in faint whispers. Nico fed him sips of broth made from onions and the scraps of dried mushrooms that Elias still had. Meanwhile, Emery rummaged through the small cabinet, laying out any bowls or utensils that might help them. Every time Jonas moaned or drifted into restless half-sleep, Nico looked at Elias with quiet pleading in his eyes. Elias could only nod in sympathy. Despite the minimal medical supplies, they had done what they could. The rest was a test of patience and Jonas's will. At one point, Emery called Elias outside to discuss a plan of next steps. The two men stood on the porch, huddled away from the worst of the downpour. Night had long since fallen, the darkness made dense by thick clouds. A lantern cast jittery light across the slick wooden boards. Emery peered into the swirling gloom, his expression burdened. If the Rangers are coming, they'd have to approach by the old logging road. But it's a mess. No guarantee they'll make it soon. Elias rubbed the side of his neck, recalling the debris-strewn routes they'd traversed. "True," he agreed softly, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "But you said the helicopter might be an option in a day or two, right?" Emery shrugged, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. "They mentioned it over the radio, but that's assuming the weather clears enough for safe flight. If the storm rages on, we might be stuck here, hoping Jonas can fight off infection until conditions improve." Elias tightened his jaw, feeling an unwanted surge of helplessness. In these past days, he had thrown himself into the role of rescuer. Yet nature's merciless downpour and Jonas's precarious condition reminded him that they were at the mercy of forces beyond any single individual's control. At least they had Emery's supplies, which were already making a difference. Elias couldn't help but feel a flicker of gratitude for the old man's selflessness. Once, Elias would have distrusted any stranger meddling in his life. Now he found himself relying on Emery's experience just as Jonas and Nico relied on him. Though he said little, Elias knew there was a fragile chain of dependence here that bound them all inextricably. They returned indoors to discover that Jonas had awakened. His gaze roamed the dim cabin, resting on Emery's unfamiliar figure with mild alarm. Elias crouched next to him. "Jonas, this is Emery," he explained. "He has a radio. He's trying to help us get a rescue team out here." Jonas's lips parted and he managed a soft, "Thank you." Emery offered a small nod, trying to mask the compassion in his eyes behind a gruff demeanor. "Don't mention it," he said, checking the bandages. "You hold on. We'll get you out of this mess." In the thick hush that followed, Nico asked Emery about the dogs back at his shack, probably looking for any friendly topic to fill the tension. Emery told the boy brief tales of how he'd found them abandoned near an old mill site and nursed them back to health. The story resonated with Nico, whose face lit with interest. For a moment, the cabin's damp gloom lessened, but Jonas's labored breathing soon brought them back to reality. Another wave of fever made him shiver under the blankets. Elias helped Nico swap out compresses while Emery prepared a fresh pot of hot water. Each gesture felt like part of a rhythm, an unspoken dance of survival. Time blurred again in the endless patter of rain. They took shifts sleeping, though no one slept deeply. Elias dozed in short intervals by the fireplace, awakening to the hiss of wind through the cracks. Nico curled up beside his father, refusing to move unless absolutely necessary. Emery stationed himself at the door, occasionally braving the downpour to listen for any sound of an approaching vehicle. But all that came was the ceaseless drumming of water on sodden earth. When morning arrived, Elias felt the now familiar dread coil in his stomach. This was the day the Rangers might attempt to reach them, or the day a helicopter might fly overhead, if the storm let up. But as he peered out through the shuttered window, the sky looked no less bleak, and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. Inside, Jonas's condition remained precarious. Though the fever receded in brief lulls, he drifted in and out of consciousness, trembling under the blankets. Once or twice he called out nonsensical phrases as though tangled in nightmares. Nico kept vigil, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Around midday, Emery pulled Elias aside. "We've got to check that logging road," he said quietly. "If the Rangers are trying to get through, maybe we can meet them part way. We can lead them back here, show them how to avoid the worst of the slides." Elias glanced at Jonas, biting the inside of his cheek. Leaving again felt like an agonizing risk, but it might speed the rescue that Jonas so desperately needed. "All right," he said. "I'll come with you." They prepared quickly, donning coats and boots. Nico fussed, clearly frightened at the thought of both men leaving. But Emery reassured him, explaining that every hour counted. Jonas croaked a whisper, "Go," and a faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. We'll be here." His voice trembled, but the spark in his eyes showed he hadn't given up. Elias pressed a hand gently against Jonas's arm, then turned to Nico. "Keep him warm. Boil water if he starts shivering again. We'll be back." Setting out, the two men followed the path behind the cabin that Elias once used for short foraging trips. Now it had turned into a slippery channel of mud, forcing them to cling to tree trunks for balance. The wind spat rain intermittently, making conversation difficult. Elias led them around a steep drop-off, recalling where a partial rock slide had blocked the logging road only days earlier. Emery, though fit for his age, panted with the effort of negotiating the treacherous terrain. Finally, they reached a vantage point overlooking a jagged break in the road, mud and debris piled up chest-high. The path beyond was a chaos of fallen limbs and slick stones, with no sign of anyone trying to clear it. Emery surveyed the scene with a grim scowl. If the Rangers tried to come this way, they'd be stopped cold. Another route might exist, but it's risky to guess where they'd try. Elias exhaled slowly, feeling trapped by nature's obstinacy. "We can try circling around," he suggested. Emery nodded, and they pressed on. For another 2 hours, they skirted the ridges and gullies in hopes of spotting tire tracks, fresh footprints, any evidence that help was on its way. Each time they rounded a bend or cleared a patch of dense undergrowth, all they found was more wreckage from storms. Fallen pines splintered on the ground, streams swollen to impassable depths. The wind picked up, bending branches in low groans. Not a single human voice or engine hum cut through that wilderness. By mid-afternoon, Emery leaned on his shovel, shoulders slumping. "We might be chasing ghosts," he said under his breath, wiping rainwater off his brow. "No way a standard truck could get in here unless it's got specialized equipment." The frustration rose like bile in Elias's throat. Nico's face flashed in his mind, bracing himself as Jonas tried to breathe through pain. If the Rangers were delayed indefinitely, what then? He swallowed hard, glancing at Emery. "We can't just give up. Let's try that lookout point near the waterfall. At least we might see if a chopper's in the sky." Emery hesitated, then nodded. "It's a hike, but let's do it." They forged on another mile, trudging up a slope choked with brambles. A light rain pelted them, not enough to flood the terrain again, but enough to make every rock slippery. At last they reached a broad outcrop overlooking a canyon where water cascaded over jagged ledges. The roar of the waterfall reverberated, drowning out ordinary sounds. The view was spectacular and forbidding. A gray tapestry of cliffs and pine-laden hills, clouds swirling overhead. Emery raised his hand to shield his eyes, scanning the horizon. Elias narrowed his gaze, peering past the distant ridges for any speck that might be a helicopter. Nothing but slate sky and drifting mist. Minutes passed. A hollow resignation crept into Elias's chest. The wind whipped around them as though mocking their hopes. Emery set his jaw and offered a short nod. "We can't wait forever. Let's get back to the cabin before dark, see if Jonas's fever's improved." Elias wanted to rail at the injustice of it, help just out of reach, nature's grip too strong. But his mind flashed again with the image of Jonas's pale face. "Yes, we should go," he agreed, voice rough. They retraced their steps, descending carefully. Each footfall on mossy stones or mud-slick paths reminded Elias how precarious life was in these hills. The forest had once felt like a refuge from his failure and shame. Now he realized it could also be a prison, barring any easy escape. Emery's occasional coughs and grunts underscored the toll on them both. Yet they carried on, fueled by the knowledge that Jonas and Nico waited. Late afternoon merged into early evening by the time they returned to the cabin. Twilight's deepening gloom revealed flickers of light through the shuttered window, comforting Elias in its familiarity. He opened the door, shaking off rain from his coat. Nico sprang to his feet, hope in his expression. Then it fell when he realized they were alone. "Nobody?" the boy asked, voice tight. Emery dropped his shovel, removing his hat in a gesture of defeat. "Not yet, kid. Maybe tomorrow." Jonas lay as they had left him, though his breathing seemed less labored. When he turned his head and saw them enter, relief softened his features, but Elias noticed how his cheeks glistened with feverish sweat. Jonas rasped, "Any sign of the Rangers?" Emery shook his head. "Too many slides blocking the roads. We're hoping a chopper might come if the weather breaks." Jonas closed his eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. Silence settled over them, punctuated by the hiss of rainfall on the shingles. Elias unclasped the backpack, fishing out a fresh bandage roll. "Let's make sure your leg's still okay," he said, forcing optimism. Nico scrambled to help, handing Elias strips of cloth. Emery set water to boil, already preparing for another evening of vigil. As Elias carefully unwrapped Jonas's splint, he felt the swelling under his palms, still warm, but not as scalding as before. Encouraged, he finished examining the wound. Jonas barely flinched this time, either too exhausted or too numb to protest. Nico inhaled slowly. "He seems a little better, right?" The boy's eyes fixed on Elias, seeking affirmation. Elias nodded. "Yes," he said, and for once the word came out strong. Perhaps it was merely incremental improvement, but he refused to diminish the tiny spark of hope. That spark was all they had. Emery, crouched by the fireplace, added softly, "And tomorrow's another day. Let's see what it brings." Night had fallen once again, and the unending rain continued its ceaseless percussion against the cabin roof. Inside, every breath felt weighted by anticipation. Nico dozed fitfully at Jonas's side, drifting into shallow sleep, only to jolt awake whenever his father shifted. Emery, hunched near the doorway, listened for any hint of engines beyond the pounding rain, and Elias, pacing by the fire, struggled to quell the tangle of thoughts tumbling through his mind: fear for Jonas's life, hope that rescue would come, and a quiet resolve to endure. Each time he glanced at the small window, he silently urged the sky to clear, as though mere willpower might cut through the pall of storm clouds. Shortly after midnight, Jonas stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he reached for the water cup resting near his pallet. Nico hurried to help, pressing the cup gently to his father's lips. Jonas drank in small sips, his fingers trembling around the rim. Though exhaustion radiated from him, a faint steadiness had returned to his gaze. Emery, observing from the corner, rose to check the bandage. The swelling was still pronounced, the broken leg a throbbing reminder of how fragile their tenuous peace remained. Yet Jonas managed to keep his eyes focused on Emery's movements, wincing only when the older man tightened the fresh strips of cloth. "How do you feel?" Elias asked, voice hushed to avoid startling Nico, who looked ready to break under the strain of worry. Jonas swallowed hard. "Alive," he answered, almost managing a dry laugh. His face shone with perspiration, but the flush of fever had receded just a little. Emery ran a rough hand over his stubbled chin. "We're getting that fever down, but you still need proper care." Jonas nodded, exhausted acceptance in his eyes. Nico's features were drawn tight, but relief lit them when he realized his father could speak more coherently. Elias handed the boy a tin bowl containing a watery broth, steeped with onion and a pinch of salt. Nico stirred it, blowing softly, then helped Jonas sip. Watching them, Elias felt a fierce protectiveness swell in his chest. Once upon a time, he had believed that caring for others only led to hurt. Now he could not imagine walking away. The hush in the cabin grew momentarily less oppressive as Jonas slumped back, calmer for having eaten. In the lull that followed, Emery suggested another attempt at contacting someone via radio. The battery-operated unit he had brought was limited, hardly as powerful as the one at his own shack, but maybe, if the rain let up, a signal might slip through. Elias helped him carry it onto the porch. The thick wooden door banged shut, muffling the inside of the cabin. Out in the open, they found only a wall of wind-lashed darkness. Emery clicked on the radio, scanning frequencies while Elias held the lantern at an angle to keep water from splattering inside. Static crackled. Emery spoke in a loud, clear tone, repeating the name of the region, describing Jonas's injuries, imploring for any rescue detail. Each time, the radio spat only hiss and occasional garbled bursts that might have been distant transmissions. Emery exhaled in frustration, raising his voice against the wind. "This is Emery Turner. Urgent medical need. Does anyone read?" A moment of silence followed by a faint squeal of feedback. Then, in a flicker of sheer luck, a voice broke through, weak but discernible. "Copy. Rescue. Inbound. Patch. Next day. Stand by." Emery leaned close, contorting his face in concentration. "Hello? Please repeat." "Over." Only more static replied, and then the line went silent. Still, that snippet of acknowledgement rang like a beacon. Elias and Emery exchanged glances in the darkness. "They're trying," Emery said, voice raw with cautious hope. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was better than silence. They retreated indoors, bracing themselves against the rain. Nico looked up at them, eyes reflecting lantern light. "Did you find someone?" he asked. Emery hesitated, then nodded. "We heard a voice. It was faint, but they said something about rescue inbound. Might be tomorrow, or maybe the next day." Jonas tried to form a grateful smile, though he was fading quickly from the pain. Elias crouched beside him, pressing the back of his hand to Jonas's forehead. "Fever's still there," Elias murmured, "but it hasn't spiked like before. That's good." Nico exhaled shakily, setting the broth bowl aside. The hours slid by, measured in spoonfuls of water for Jonas, logs fed to the fire, and periodic checks of the radio. The rain turned mercurial, thrashing down in sheets, then dwindling to a mist only to roar back minutes later. By mid-morning, the sky had lightened marginally, though the thick cloud cover persisted. Jonas managed to remain conscious longer, sipping water and asking in hushed tones about the day's plan. Emery repeated the faint radio message, giving Jonas a flicker of reassurance. "If they're inbound, we just have to hold tight," Emery said, tamping down his own skepticism. "You keep resting. Let your body mend." Around midday, the wind died enough for Emery to attempt the radio again. Nico hovered next to the old man on the porch, clasping his hands in nervous anticipation. Elias stayed inside with Jonas, who had dozed off, chest rising and falling in a steadier rhythm. A few minutes later, Emery's muffled shout drifted through the door. "Yes, yes, we read you." Elias's heart kicked. He slipped outside in time to hear a crackling voice. "Visibility, limited, approximate coordinates, ETA tomorrow morning if weather permits." Emery confirmed the details, giving a quick account of their location near the cabin. Nico nearly burst into tears when he heard the words "tomorrow morning." But Emery placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's the best they can do, kid. At least they're coming." The voice concluded with a request for any color marker or flare to help the pilot pinpoint the cabin's clearing. Elias frowned. Flares were out of the question, but perhaps they could use bright cloth on the ground. "We'll figure it out," he told Emery, urgency pounding in his veins. Returning inside, they found Jonas awake again, grimacing through waves of discomfort. Emery explained the plan: a helicopter rescue at first light, or as soon as the pilot could see the clearing. Jonas's relief was obvious, though overshadowed by exhaustion. "One more night," Jonas murmured, half to himself. "We can last one more night." Nico squeezed his father's hand in silent agreement, tears shining in the corners of his eyes. Elias set about clearing a patch of ground outside the cabin, hoping to make a crude landing area, or at least an identifiable zone amid the soggy forest. The persistent drizzle made him curse under his breath as he dragged away branches, piling them in a corner. Once done, he checked the stable behind the cabin, a ramshackle lean-to rather than a proper stable, scavenging anything that might serve as a marker. He found a folded sheet of bright blue canvas, once used to patch the roof. Perfect. That evening, as darkness once more wrapped the forest, Elias and Emery spread the canvas in the open ground near the cabin, anchoring it with stones so it wouldn't blow away. If morning brought enough light and a break in the clouds, the helicopter might spot that splash of color against the dark earth. Nico watched from the porch, an unspoken hope etched on his face. Inside, Jonas's condition precariously wavered between fatigue and short, lucid intervals. When he managed to speak, he thanked Emery again for braving the wilderness, and he thanked Elias for saving Nico in that fateful storm. Elias didn't know how to respond. Gratitude felt foreign, and yet every time Jonas's voice shook with emotion, Elias was reminded of the fragile bond tying them together in this remote corner of the world. Had they never crashed? Had Elias never walked outside that night? They might all have remained strangers, adrift in their own private sorrows. Dusk arrived in muted tones of charcoal and gray, the forest once more plunging into a watery twilight. The four of them gathered near the hearth, nibbling on sparse rations. Jonas forced down a few spoonfuls of the onion broth, trying to hide his grimaces from Nico. Emery shared bits of his life story, a distant family he rarely visited, a career spent felling trees, then living off the scraps of old logging camps. Nico listened with rapt attention. He asked quiet questions as though searching for any distraction from the hours that lay ahead. Elias, leaning against the wall, observed them with a silent wonder. Had he not hidden here for so many years, he might have found out sooner that empathy is a powerful force, stronger than the coldest storms or the darkest regrets. That night, they found a rhythm in their watchfulness. Emery slept first, leaving Elias and Nico to tend Jonas. The boy drifted off eventually, his head lolling on his father's uninjured side. Jonas, though drowsy, whispered a few lingering words of gratitude. Elias responded with halting confessions, that he'd once believed all human connections led only to betrayal, that seeing Nico's desperate face that first night had awakened something he thought he'd lost. He wondered if Jonas could even hear him. Still, it felt freeing to speak those truths into the quiet. Toward the early hours of the morning, Emery took over, letting Elias doze. A hush settled as the rain eased to a soft patter. Once, Elias stirred to find Jonas mumbling restlessly, Nico stroking his father's hair to soothe him. Then he sank back into a shallow dream, half believing he heard the distant thrum of a helicopter cutting through the wind. At first light, Emery shook Elias awake. "Listen," he hissed, pointing outside. A pulsing noise grew, distant yet distinct, the chug of an engine in the sky. Nico shot up, eyes wide. Elias jumped to his feet, heart hammering. Grabbing the lantern, he and Emery rushed onto the porch, scanning the gray dawn. Overhead, clouds churned, but a faint break revealed a small aircraft cresting the ridge, its rotor blades slicing mist. The noise crescendoed until a helicopter emerged, dipping low over the treetops. Elias saw a flash of color, emergency markings on the side. Emery waved his arms, calling to Nico to bring the bright canvas. The helicopter circled once, as if verifying the clearing, and then slowly lowered, stirring wind that drove rain in sideways gusts. Elias shielded his face, hope surging so strongly it nearly tore through him. The Rangers had made it. Moments later, two figures in rescue gear leapt from the chopper, wading through mud toward the cabin. Nico rushed inside, guiding them to Jonas, who managed a weak smile of relief. In a flurry of urgent motion, they checked vital signs, rigged a portable stretcher, and prepared Jonas for transport. The rotor's roar made conversation impossible, but everything about their movements spoke of competence and reassurance. Nico hovered, face streaked with tears that were equal parts fear and gratitude. In less than 30 minutes, Jonas lay strapped into the helicopter, with Nico allowed to sit beside him. Before climbing in, Nico looked back at Elias, lips trembling. Elias stepped forward, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll be okay," Elias said, forcing each word past the tightness in his throat. "They'll take care of both of you." Nico threw his arms around Elias, hugging him fiercely. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Then the rotors spun up again, and the helicopter rose, carrying away Jonas, Nico, and the promise of advanced medical help. Emery and Elias stood in the churned mud, squinting against the whipping wind as the chopper vanished into the pewter sky. Silence followed, broken only by the steady drip of rain from the eaves. Elias found himself breathing in ragged gasps, an unexpected sense of both loss and triumph coiling in his gut. Emery clapped a hand on his shoulder. "He'll live," the old man murmured, voice thick. "They'll be safe now." Nodding, Elias wiped at his face, not entirely sure if the droplets on his skin were raindrops or tears. For 5 years, he had lived alone in a fortress of regret. Now that fortress had cracked open, letting in 2 strangers he had never expected, and forging a connection that would reverberate far beyond one stormy night. He stared at the empty sky, relieved beyond measure yet oddly hollow. There was relief in knowing Jonas would heal, that Nico wouldn't have to keep watch alone. Yet a quiet ache reminded him that the cabin felt different now, as though the walls themselves remembered every whispered plea, every feverish breath. Emery turned toward him with a slow nod. "I can radio the hospital later. Find out where they took him if you'd like." Elias forced a grateful smile. "Yes," he said, quietly determined. "I'd like that very much. They might be strangers no longer." Rain tapped gently overhead, and through the shifting clouds, a pale sun threatened to break free. For the first time in years, Elias welcomed the light.